Hello and welcome to another Try Mechanics podcast. This podcast is all about recovery nutrition. So this is quite an interesting topic, and I've mentioned a few of the different bits and pieces on a few of the other podcasts. So I'm going to try and bring everything together and try and go over what are the key elements of recovery nutrition, why it's so important, why it essentially forms that other half of the elements of recovery, really, and that without it, then you could actually be doing more harm than good. I'm going to talk about the things that you definitely should be including, the things that maybe you don't need to worry quite as much about based on the current evidence, and whether there's anything that you're taking in that can significantly inhibit recovery. And then we're going to talk about how the lack of food could actually enhance recovery too. So just a rough kind of set of notes to start off this, just if you're in a bit of a rush. So the first thing is that recovery nutrition goes far beyond the kind of protein and carbohydrates. So we're going to be discussing that. And it's not about getting necessarily adequate protein and carbohydrate. It's often the right kind of protein with the right amino acids and a carbohydrate source that allows you to restock glycogen and your carb fuel sources fast enough for what you require. Secondly, that there's essentially no kind of magic window, that the speed of repair and essentially restocking those is really based on the kind of continual intake or the amount of intake in the kind of few hours post-exercise. It's just essentially the speed that changes. We're going to talk about the fact that eating a whole food is actually really, really important when it comes to these elements, particularly when it comes to protein. And then finally talking about the fact that the mitochondria, the powerhouses in the cells, actually recover when we aren't eating, when they are allowed to repair themselves and then essentially start the whole process off again. So actually not eating is an important element of recovery. Okay, so when I ask this question, when I ask about recovery nutrition, I almost get the same reply every time, that it's all about just basically protein and carbohydrates, that there's a window post-exercise that you need to try and get these carbohydrates and protein in, otherwise you're doing yourself more harm than good. So the evidence has come out and said that that's not really the case, that yes, there is an enhancement in that initial phase, very possibly from high dose kind of protein when you're doing things like weightlifting, when you're actually causing damage, causing a lot of signals that require you to switch on the kind of mTOR, the protein building pathways, get everything building as quickly as possible. And there is possibly a benefit to putting a load of protein in and possibly some carbohydrates as well in that time phase. Interestingly, actually, there's some more evidence that you taking your protein just before you start that kind of workout, so let's say a weightlifting workout, might actually be more beneficial, because as you're digesting it, the protein and the amino acids are getting to the right place. But as an endurance athlete, you probably don't need to worry as much, and I don't think you need to worry as much after cycling and running and swimming, because they're not essentially as destructive on the body. And what it then becomes is a case of a signaling pathway issue, in that, or you're taking in that food in the hours post-exercise to encourage essentially the signaling pathways to build and rebuild that muscle and make everything essentially stronger, and rebuild and sort out things like the mitochondria, those kind of powerhouses of the cells. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I wouldn't worry too much about getting things in. So if you've got the option of having essentially whole food, then I would probably go down that route if you're going to have that within an hour or two of doing exercise. If you are somebody that struggles to get in enough protein, then maybe protein shakes, this would probably be a very useful time to use them. So something like a whey protein shake is not particularly well absorbed when it compare it to whole proteins. So we tend to take in much higher percentages of whole proteins, maybe 50 to 60 to 70% when we're talking about kind of eggs and chicken and beef and those things. Pure essential amino acids, we tend to take almost all of them up, and they almost all go somewhere and get used. Whey protein is relatively low. I think it's around the 20%, but I'll have to recheck that. The key end up is that actually it's often because there is a big load of certain amino acids taken in very quickly. Now, when it comes to amino acids, I always have this argument with, or not an argument as such, but it's a debate between a couple of the fractions of, for instance, veganism and vegetarianism that say that vegetarian and vegan sources of proteins are whole proteins. And yes, they are. In terms of the fact that with enough of those different things, you can take in all of the essential amino acids that you require. The problem is what we're finding out now is that doesn't really cover the full picture. We are not equal. If we think about all the amino acids, we essentially are not equal across those amino acids. We are, as animals, we have certain different levels of those amino acids in our body because we have different tissues. That's the kind of critical thing. So there's certain amino acids that we actually we will essentially require more of. Now, they might not be essential. That's the key thing, is that essential amino acids are the amino acids that we cannot make ourselves. But there are amino acids like glycine that we can make, but we don't make enough of. Now, that becomes essentially quite critical because essentially the intake of that becomes a limiting factor if we want to increase or essentially improve our ability to lay down certain tissues like connective tissue. So we've got about 20 amino acids, or there are 20 amino acids that are in the kind of proteins that we take in, and approximately 10 of those are regarded as essential because we don't make them. But as I say, is that actually the different balance of those amino acids in certain foods is very variable. So your meats and various other animal products tend to be higher in the amino acids that we need more of. Now, as I say, glycine is a very good example that is very low in almost all vegetarian, vegan products, but is very high in certain elements of animal products. But the other key thing is that those are the parts of the product we're not actually taking in. So that's the critical thing. As I mentioned this before, if you consider chicken breast as a whole food, then you'd be wrong. It is a refined food because it does not have, if it's had skin and various other structures around it taken away, therefore you don't get the glycine, the proline, the structures or the amino acids that make up those structures into your diet. And actually the problem is that if you take in a lot of muscle meat that has a lot of amino acids called methionine in it, you actually then increase your need for glycine. So actually then even though you're only producing 1 or 2 grams of it, you use that to try and essentially deal with the methylation required to deal with the methionine. So it creates, again, a bit more of a problem. So there's a little bit more to nuance this. So when it comes to athletes, I tend to advise taking essentially a supplement of either glycine and gelatin, or just gelatin. Gelatin is relatively cheap, and there's a brand called Go Nutrition I've mentioned a few times. It's about £4 on eBay for Amazon for about 250 grams, and is a fantastic tool in the athlete's toolbox because it increases that uptake into. If you look at Keith Barr's research, it increases that uptake into collagen tendons, but also helps repair. It's not just about increasing uptake. It's not just about optimizing with some of these things. It is about the fact that you are breaking those tissues down, and you may end up getting injured if you are not able to create enough. If you are breaking too many of these tissues down, then you essentially, not only in terms of the physical damage, but it also creates signals that the body responds to. And this could be what's related to things like overtraining syndrome. Someone once said that overtraining syndrome is nothing more than under-eating for a long period of time when you're training. And that's really actually quite an important point, is that actually, provided the right eating and the right food, there is good evidence that you will stave off significant amounts of overtraining, or essentially that move from overreaching into overtraining. Okay, so the first key point is that to get good amount of protein and carbohydrates in, you're looking for about 20 to 30 grams in the few hours post-workout, generally in the form of whole foods. Hopefully the whole food that includes things like glycine. If it doesn't, then adding in a little bit of gelatin, maybe 5-10 grams, would be an excellent addition to your kind of recovery routine. So that's the first thing. So when we go beyond that, we're starting to think about what are the other elements of recovery. One of the other key things is the idea of inflammation. Now, we don't really fully understand inflammation. What is it? It's essentially, we've got acute inflammation that results as a result of training, as a result of injury and all these things, infection and various other things. And we've also got chronic inflammation, which is almost, you could say, this kind of development of having low levels of inflammation in areas that maybe shouldn't be inflammatory over a long period of time. And when you're looking at essentially levels of inflammation in terms of the athlete, we are creating a lot of inflammation from the exercise side of things. Therefore, we need to have periods where we're resting and recovering and allowing that inflammation to go down, because we're creating the inflammation, creating essentially the damage, creating the stimulus to improve, then the inflammation needs to go down so we can direct all the right things to all the right tissues to repair and recover. And I've often said that I believe that a lot of tendon issues and all these things might be related to the fact that we never get that inflammation back down to essentially a normal baseline level. So the key thing about this is that I've often regarded this as the training outside of, the diet outside of training. So when you take away the training element, let's say you train twice a day, you've got two, let's say, training eating windows of around an hour before to around 2 hours afterwards, then you've got a bit of a gap, then you've got another eating window later on in the day. So outside of those windows, it is important, I believe, particularly when you're thinking of things like the evening meal that's going into then the night, is making sure that you're taking in things that will enhance your ability to deal with the inflammation. Now, that is a very key point. I've always been a big believer, and the evidence has come out about this, that antioxidants, supplementing with them is a really bad idea. If you read Ben Goldacre's book on bad science, he will go over the fact that antioxidant prescription, high doses of vitamin C and all those things have almost invariably caused actually more damage. Now, we believe it might be, and we know that obviously it happens, it actually reduces your adaptation to exercise. So that could be why in these studies, these pure health studies, why you got a reduction in essentially health markers as a result of that. Because if you flood your body with what are relatively high amounts of single antioxidants like vitamin C, at the times when they don't really need it, it stifles the body's ability to adapt and recover and move on from that. Because what it does is the body is the amount of antioxidants in cells. And the reason you need the antioxidants, I'll just quickly say, is that as you're respiring, as you're using energy, you're creating oxidants, essentially free radicals. And the antioxidants are there to mop them up so they don't damage anything precious. So that's why they're important. However, we have more than enough antioxidants within our cells. Sometimes all we need to improve things is a bit of a stimulus to produce a bit more. And exercise is that. So exercise is probably the most potent antioxidant you can think of because it is a pro-oxidant, but just in the right dose, encourages the cells to produce more. The same as things like red wine and red chilies and those things. They are oxidants. They actually cause the mild amount of essentially damage that then promotes the cell to try and produce more so that it can protect itself better in the future. And that's a far better way of doing it than throwing in shed loads of antioxidants. Things like blueberries, again, it's a kind of mismatch, is that they do have some antioxidants, but they also have some oxidants. So that colour, the polyphenols and various other things, work with us. They work with our bacteria. They work with all these elements to try and make sure that we are producing antioxidants and producing our own antioxidants. Okay? So when it comes to that, there's also lots of other things that improve recovery nutrition when it comes to reducing inflammation, helping the body to recover. Now, that's when it's not a direct thing. So you've got direct reduction. You can increase or decrease inflammation by using things like ibuprofen. So you could block inflammation with ibuprofen, but that's not what we want to do because that inflammation is a good idea. What we want to do is help the body then recover and repair. Now, the things that we have available to us on that front are fish oils. Now, fish oils from fish are the best, definitely, is that you're actually much better off getting a bit of piece of salmon, a bit of mackerel, because they're far more stable. You can actually heat them in the fish and they don't get as easily damaged as a fish oil capsule. If a fish oil capsule is exposed to sunlight, it generally oxidizes. I also supplement a little bit on the side with a little bit of krill oil because it's quite a high potency, much more potent than fish oil, but it is nowhere near the amount of fish oil. So I make sure I get oily fish in almost every day. So I almost every day have a bit of salmon, a bit of mackerel or sardines or something somewhere into my diet every day. I think that's really important. And also fish oils have been shown to improve that response to exercise in terms of the muscle building side of things. So it's a win-win. The other side of things is you want things like monounsaturated fats and good vitamins that you get from avocados, a great example. So an avocado is a fantastic anti-inflammatory vegetable, And it's been shown in studies to actually reduce inflammation from taking in things like red meat. The hamburger study was a fantastic study, possibly the worst designed study that you can think of. But it showed that when you gave essentially a seared hamburger that often created a lot of inflammation in the blood because of what called ages that are the seared bit on the outside, that giving the avocado at the same time significantly reduced that inflammation. It was brilliant. So avocados, olive oil, a little bit of olive oil, lemon, and those things are all fantastic at managing your own inflammation. That's what you should be thinking of, is that you're creating inflammation with exercise and then you're managing it again. So making sure you're getting those things in outside of that kind of training window. Nuts and seeds in small doses. So I'm talking about 5-6 kernels maybe. So big doses, they tend to go pro-inflammatory because they've got a lot of omega-6 in. So if you have them, in low doses, walnuts are fantastic. They've got a very high source. They've got a lot of omega-6 in, but they've also got some great plant-based omega-3s, which also help work with that inflammatory pathway. So walnuts are fantastic. Just having a few nuts here and there is a really good adjunct into that. So that's the kind of recovery side of things. Now, thinking on a slightly different track in terms of mitochondria. Now, I've mentioned this before. Mitochondria are your little energy powerhouses. And when you get a certain age, they become even more important because they start to not be quite as good. They're a little bit like, if you look at our skin, it starts to age and starts to deteriorate. And we know that a lot of diseases are related to the mitochondria not fully functioning. Because if they fully function, then we don't get issues with diabetes and various other metabolic diseases because we're able to process all that energy that's coming into our systems. But if we continually over-consume on the energy and we don't actually have mitochondria that can function with it, we cause lots of problems. The key thing is that mitochondria are absolutely critical to exercise performance because they're the ones that process our energy. They're the ones we're trying to increase the number of all the time. That's why those are the ones we're trying to increase essentially the ability to burn both fat and carbohydrates, which is where the kind of carb cycling and things come in, because we're often looking at markers of mitochondrial improvement and biogenesis when we're using things like carb cycling and sleep low. The key thing is that I've described the mitochondria as a bit like a wood-burning furnace. They can only be repaired when they are basically have been switched off. So what we need to do in that situation, what we need to create is a situation where we're not using them to the nth degree and not overloading them so that they can cool down, but also providing the right materials. So this is why it is important to the ideal would be, if you wanted to increase mitochondrial repair, is to have a good amount of protein in the diet, so to support mitochondrial repair, and then go through a period of fasting, essentially not eating for about 12 to 14 hours a day. Now, the key thing about that is that it's at 12 to 14 hours where the energy status is low enough to repair. So the critical thing is that if you're having a massive evening meal, and this is a very good example of why having a small evening meal is much more preferable, is because if you're having a large evening meal and the digestion is relatively slow at that time, we know that your melatonin inhibits your insulin and various other markers. It may actually back up and actually inhibit your digestion to slow everything down so that you're not suddenly absorbing all that food at the same time. Then you can see that actually your fasting period isn't from just after you ate, 5 minutes, because actually it's from when you stop digesting that food. And if that digestion is going on for hours and hours and hours longer, the fasting window overnight gets very small. So the best thing to do is have a relatively small, relatively early evening meal at maybe 6, maybe up to 7 o'clock. Relatively small, higher in protein, a good amount of protein, relatively lower in fat, because that will slow down the absorption again. And the amount of carbohydrates relative to how much exercise you've done. Then having that good period overnight where you're not eating, obviously, and you're sleeping. Then in the morning, maybe making sure that you're not eating essentially until you really feel like you need to. That can actually extend that window a little bit more. But if you can make sure that window is about 12 hours. So for most people, let's say you're finishing eating at 6:30 at night. They're not having your kind of coffee and things and various eating things again till about 6:30 in the morning. You're probably doing fine. Maybe having the coffee and things at 6:30 and having breakfast at maybe 7, 8 o'clock, or even pushing it out slightly further may enhance the process just ever so slightly more. but it's the key is that getting that phase where you're not eating. So that's probably the best thing to do is having if you're doing an evening training session aimed at trying to increase the mitochondrial biogenesis, then having your kind of slightly higher protein, slightly moderate amount of carbohydrates and lower in essentially fats in that evening meal to allow then the mitochondria to repair and recover overnight. And that is a very, very important element of mitochondrial biogenesis, and essentially recovery within the cells. And that also helps you recover and your ability to then move on and do more training and everything the next day. So I hope that's given you a good overview of all the different elements of recovery nutrition, just as a final guide, making sure that you're getting that protein and carbohydrates mostly from whole sources in within a few hours of training, making sure you're getting lots of anti-inflammatory foods such as fish oils, fish, and avocados, olive oils, and those sort of things into your diet on a regular basis, trying to get a bit of glycine in from amino acids that actually support collagen and tendon repair, particularly if you are a runner or you're doing a lot of running, so things like gelatin. And then finally, making sure that you're always having that window where you're not eating so that you're enhancing your mitochondria, enhancing their ability to recover and repair. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you soon.